Yo, what is up guys, Grim here, and in today's video we're going to be going over all the top candidates for the best league starters of Siege of the Atlas. The manifesto is out. We have a really good idea of the changes that are going to be coming down the pipeline. And the patch notes, of course, everything is subject to change until those drop, and of course the patch hits. But we have a pretty damn good idea of what's getting nerfed, what's getting buffed, and what's going unchanged. So without further ado, let's get into it. But if you haven't already, like the video and subscribe if you like the content. Really helps me out and I really appreciate it. So let's get into it. So first up here, we have three different categories. Mappers. So mappers are really fast builds that don't really get their boss damage at all or until much later on. So builds like, bow builds, wanders, stuff like this. We have hybrid builds, which are, kind of good at everything. They're not insane at bossing. They're not going to be the first people on the server to kill Uber Elder, but they're also not insane at mapping. They're kind of a middle ground. So they're going to be really good for, farming stuff like Cirrus. They've got good bossing potential, but also reasonable mapping potential. These are the kind of characters which speedrunners generally tend to favor as their kind of selections due to the fact that they're kind of got the potential to push the bosses, but also got the potential to do maps really fast. And lastly, we have bosses. These guys are basically hyper-focused on, getting to bosses really, really quick, maybe doing really high waves of simulacrum really early, and, crushing content that way to be successful in the PoE economy. So those are the kind of categories we have here. Let's dive into the builds here, and I'll break down each and every one of them a little bit for you guys so you kind of know what you're getting into. So without further ado, let's get into it. So first up on the list here, no surprise, Corrupting Fever. One of the more powerful builds you could start in 3.16. I started it myself along with a lot of people on this channel following along, and it is definitely one of the more powerful ones out there. It's absolutely probably one of the strongest mappers you can go with due to the fact that it has inbuilt explosion pops as well as some form of explosion proliferation for its damage over time effects. So Corrupting Fever is at its heart a damage over time build, but it functions very similarly to other wand kind of type based builds like Kinetic Blast as well as Tornado Shot builds, whichever one you may want to prefer. It gets extremely defensive and extremely fast. It boasts speed and movement speed that of a Deadeye, but also packs quite a lot of defenses, as I mentioned. The explosions for free and has up to 10 million DPS in the end game with good gear, meaning it's a mapper which starts out very, very fast and very, very efficient. And it also can transition all the way into a bosser by the end of the game when you get all your gear, and it's fully capable of doing all of the content, maybe with the exception of Wave 30 Simulacrum unless you get insane gear, but it's fully able to do stuff like the Feared and the Maven in the current meta, so I should have no issues taking down all of the new content in the new meta, assuming we don't get any secret nerfs on the patch notes. All of the leveling is generally pretty well documented, and it's pretty smooth after you get past the first few acts, and it's definitely a complete joyride to play. Really, really powerful mapper, and as such, it stands head and shoulders above all other options for that kind of category. So there's actually no other mappers that I would recommend past Corrupting Fever if you're looking for that kind of playstyle, as it just really does have it all. You get Exploding Chest for free, you get the movement speed, you get the AoE, you can scale into more bosses later on. It really is unmatched in that type of playstyle. Alright, next up, Hybrid. We have Poisonous Concoction, a skill that I believe came out in Scourge League and absolutely took the game by storm. One of the best scaling skills currently in the game. It has shotgunning potential, it has insane poison scaling. Poison is one of the most high scaling mechanics in the game, as you can scale its duration, you can scale the speed at which it does damage, you can scale how much you hit for, you can scale how many times you shotgun. It's so crazy. There's tons of different axes to scale Poisonous Concoction, and in addition to that, you don't require a weapon. It's a bit of a clunky skill to play. If I had to describe what it's similar to, it's a little bit like Blade for Blade Blast from the days of old. You do have to aim this skill, but you also do get Plague Bearer as a crutch, which is what makes it more of a hybrid skill, as you do have that insane clear speed when that is up. But overall, it's going to be a build which can rip through the maps. It has insane scaling early on, and you will be able to do pretty much all the content without having too much gear investment, and it is going to be able to take down most of the bosses in the game without having to worry. In addition to that, as it is with Corrupting Fever, Poisonous Concoction has the ability to get free explosions if you go for an Occultist Ascendancy, which is quite nice on the clear, and also it is incredibly defensive. Poisonous Concoction is a build that uses a shield, and also due to the fact it doesn't really require much in the way of damage scaling, as it's just such an insane skill by itself, it can also invest heavily in defenses, which is incredibly beneficial to it. You know, picking stuff up like Determination is definitely a really good one as well. So Poisonous Concoction would definitely recommend. It wasn't anywhere in the manifesto, and it is already one of the most overpowered skills that you can pick, and there's already a really good guide out there by Isoro, so definitely would recommend picking this one up as your league starter. So next up, we have a tried and true, old staple, old favorite, Toxic Rain partnered with Caustic Arrow. So this is one of the skills that did get hit on the manifesto. It received a numerical nerf, probably about of 25%, if I had to guess off the top of my head, which is definitely a sizable nerf, but there were some bow changes to quivers, as well as seemingly bow bases to make up for this. So Toxic Rain should be in a reasonably similar place to where it normally is. And if you follow along with some of the kind of recent builds that have been put out with Toxic Rain, this again, similar to Corrupting Fever and Poisonous Concoction, can get incredibly durable. One of the more tanky builds that you can select with the introduction of Spell Suppression and Scourge League, you can definitely stand in stuff like Sirius's Die Beams and stuff like that. You can have the option to run Determination and all sorts of different other mechanics to really tank up and beef up. It has respectable damage and respectable clear. I'd probably put it on the level of Poisonous Concoction clear, with maybe, you know, a few downsides due to the fact of not having Plague Bearer. It's basically the kind of more middle ground of Corrupting Fever, nowhere near the clear speed of Corrupting Fever, but also it does scale a lot earlier on in terms of its damage, and it doesn't require as much gear as Corrupting Fever to get into the endgame bosses and get them down. So definitely a pretty good one to start. You know, everyone knows Toxic Rain is an old staple. It's definitely no surprise that it's on here, and the nerf doesn't really do much to stop it in terms of its potential. All right, what do we got next? Explosive Arrow. So this is the new kid on the block. Lots of rumbling, lots of testing has been going on with Explosive Arrow, particularly by the YouTubers Crouching Tuna and Palstron. So those are going to be your sources of truth for this build, this league. If you're interested in trying something new, this is the one that you'd probably want to try out. Explosive Arrow is a build which takes advantage of massive ignites, and is also getting buffed by about 74% more damage if we can take the manifesto at its word, and it's already fully capable of doing all content in the game. So take a build which is already insane and then buff it by 74% more damage. What do you get? Well, you get a recipe for one of probably the most insane league starters you can select. The gear requirements aren't too steep, it has reasonable defenses to boot as well, and the playstyle is actually a ballista based playstyle. You're going to be playing as an Elementalist, and you're going to be rocking quite a lot of damage over time gear. Now, overall, this is a pretty safe playstyle. You get, you know, kind of all the perks of being a minion build without any of the nerfs that happen to spell totems and all sorts of stuff like that. You get to put your totems down, run around, and you're basically good to go. And you're also a dot build, so you're kind of double dipping on that efficiency and also that quality of life. This is probably going to be one of the better builds to start off if you want to kind of have a bit of the mapping playstyle, which reasonable clear speed, and also have quite a good access to bosses. I was tempted to actually put this over in here in bossing due to the fact it just has ridiculous damage, even higher than some of the bosses that are going to be on this list with good gear. But overall, it's got reasonable clear speed as it takes advantage of Ignite Proliferation to kind of clear big swathes of packs. So I couldn't justify putting it over there in the bosser, as it just does have really good clear. I would say that it's probably the strongest pick so far from what we've seen in the hybrid list here. Well and truly above Toxic Rain, and probably quite a bit above Poisonous Concoction as well, but that remains to be seen. But you know, if you want to follow along this one, Crouching Tuna and Palstron are the big advocates for this one, and the stuff they've put together so far, even without the buffs, is quite impressive, so definitely keep your eye on that one. Alright, next up, we have Summon Skeleton Mages. So Summon Skeleton Mages is probably the premier minion build right now. It is overall quite a balanced build, can invest in quite a lot of defenses if you want to go down that route. Hardcore players play this, solo self-pound players play this, and overall on softcore trade, it was one of the first builds to actually do Wave 30 Simulacrum and get that on farm. That should basically tell you all you need to know. This is a pretty damn high burst damage build. When you couple it with Vile Summon Skeletons, as well as the normal skeletons, you can get a massive army of skeletons, which is going to basically melt most of the stuff in the game. It does have a few issues with things like invitations, but overall it's a reasonable pick, and this is got a very similar playstyle to something like Freezing Pulse Totems, due to the fact that you have to place your skeletons down, but when they are down, they, kind of shoot out very similar to Freezing Pulse. You're going to run Pierce, you're going to have GMP on them, and they're going to do pretty damn good damage. In terms of what kind of damage you can expect, you're probably looking at around the 10+ million DPS without Vile Summon Skeletons, with all your skellies up, and that's definitely nothing to sneeze at. And you also do have the option to run stuff like the Animate Guardian for stuff like Fortify, Cull, and all sorts of stuff like that. There's a ton of customization available with Summon Skeletons. You can invest in defensive auras. You can run a shield if you'd like. There's a ton of options here, and Summon Skeleton Mages I would fully expect to be one of the better picks, especially if you enjoy content like Blight, Simulacrums, and all sorts of content like this. Definitely one of the weakest mappers on this list. Minions have always traditionally been very slow at mapping, but if you're looking for the minion playstyle and you want a really strong bosser, Summon Skeletons is probably one of the better picks. All right, next up we have the Old Faithful Miner. So for as long as I can remember, all of the server first kills pretty much in every league have been done by Miner, on softcore trade that is. Maven, for example, first kill was a Miner, and pretty much every league it's the same players playing the same miners, getting the same first kills on the server. So if you're looking for the fastest bosser, the bosser that is going to get to the end game content the fastest, kill it the fastest, farm it the fastest, Miner is the pick. It didn't really get any sizable nerfs outside of the actual gems. Kind of getting really shuffled a little bit, but it doesn't really affect the skill all that much, as there is compensation in the base damage of the skills that they support. So overall, Miner is going to be the same old brand of overpowered burst that it always has been, and I don't expect too many changes to the playstyle. Some people were using the March of the Legion boots. They have been pretty much deleted, but if you weren't using those, it's basically going to be business as usual. In terms of where you should maybe look for some inspiration on this one, I would recommend Kane's Icicle Miner. That is definitely a good one to look into. He's a player that always does extremely well early on, and he's got a pretty extensive, fully written up guide for you to check out, and it's definitely a pretty interesting read. Now, definitely be warned, if you're a new player or you're someone who hasn't played a miner before, this playstyle is not for the faint of heart. You're basically a complete glass cannon. Unlike the other builds on this list, you're basically completely made of paper. You cannot take any hits at all pretty much, so you need to have basically on-point mechanics, and that may not be too synergistic with new bosses being added to the game, as you're not going to know their mechanics. They might have undodgeable mechanics, we're not sure, but in the current state of affairs, with the current bosses that we have, Miner is definitely one of the best bosses that you can pick early on, and it's going to earn you a truckload of money if you can, kind of take advantage of the playstyle that it offers. Overall, a reasonable pick. If you're comfortable with playing a very squishy glass cannon build, it may be the pick for you, with things like, obviously Icicle Mines, Fireball Mines, Frostbolt Mines, all sorts, basically everything. You can basically play any mine you want, and it's probably going to work. I think a few other people that also do play a lot of mines is Path of Math. He's probably maybe someone to check out as well. Alright, so the next one we have on here, no surprise, Detonate Dead Ignite. So Detonate Dead did receive quite an interesting change in the patch notes, but after talking to some Detonate Dead enthusiasts, they've assured me that it isn't really much of a change for the Ignite-based variant. You're still going to get the same sized Ignite as you did before, and it's pretty much going to be as consistent, and it shouldn't be any issues at all. So if you're interested in the power level of this build, it's one of the only builds which I've seen where a very high skilled player just clear the entire game on blue gear. So it basically requires no gear in order to get its damage, meaning it can fully invest into defense, and as such it's been a staple on hardcore for a very long time now, and it doesn't seem to have really gotten too many nerfs outside of the 28% Ignite nerf, which overall it's not going to be too much of a big deal. Detonate Dead's probably still a completely insane pick for League Start, and overall it's probably one of the better bosses on this list. You can supplement the clear with other skills like Armageddon Brand and such, but overall it is kind of a bossing build, and that's going to be what you want to use it for. So overall, this is my kind of A-tier league start meta analysis here. I've got quite a selection of builds here. Some of them, like Poison's Concoction and Corrupting Fever are very new. They've been tried and tested though in 3.16. They are very successful, very powerful. Skeleton Mages is a bit of a breakout build that popped up last league as well. Not too many people were playing it before, with things like Soul Rest kind of taking the limelight. Now it is really all about those Skelly Mages. They're very, very similar to Soul Rest, but pretty much superior in every way. And then we have basically 3 Old Faithfuls here, which, you know, have been meta for the longest time. And then Explosive Arrow is the new kid on the block. Plenty to choose from, plenty of fresh blood, and, you know, overall I think it's a pretty diverse meta game from what we can see without patch notes. But of course, there's going to be people who want something cutting edge, something brand new, something that they haven't seen before. So I have prepared a few things on that front of things which do look like they have a little bit of promise, and things that have been really good in the past which might be coming back. So as part of the manifesto, a lot of things have been buffed, namely self-casting spells. Now, spells have been pretty bad for the longest time, but they used to be some of the best skills in the game way back in the day. Stuff like Ethereal Knives, you know, stuff like that. And we are maybe potentially about to see a resurgence in these skills. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about those and maybe kind of give you guys a starting point if you wanted to kind of tackle something brand new, something cutting edge, which not really too many other people are doing. I'm not recommending these, but I'm saying that they are definitely on the table if you wanted to look into something brand new for yourself. So the first one here is Ethereal Knives. So Ethereal Knives is a bit of an interesting one. They've given it about 50% more base damage, which is absolutely ridiculous. They have taken a few of the projectiles away from Ethereal Knives when you kind of factor in the removal of the threshold jewel. You know, they've given a few of those projectiles to the base gem, but overall it is a nerf to the amount of projectiles, so it will feel a little bit clunkier in terms of the clear. But the main problem that Ethereal Knives always had to solve is the actual explosions that you're going to be utilizing. Back in the day before we had Conquerors of the Atlas, Herald of Ice was enough, but I'm not sure if that is the case now. So the direction I'd probably take Ethereal Knives is a fire-based Ethereal Knives build, similar to how we built old BV. That is a very effective way to scale physical-based skills, and that's probably the direction I'd take it in. But with 50% more damage, just from base damage, and almost doubling the added damage effectiveness, which will scale with things like you know, hatred and all sorts of stuff like that. This is definitely a big potential candidate for a new mapping league starter. So overall, I think it's definitely worth a look. And, you know, if you can cook up some PoBs and they're looking promising, and you can get around 5 million DPS and maybe push it to 10 million with really good gear, and you can manage the issues with the clear and also manage the mana issues, then this could be a pretty reasonable pick. As a spellcaster, you do have the option to use a shield as well, which is pretty exciting. Overall, that's definitely going to make it a reasonable pick in terms of the defense. I'd probably play this potentially as a Pathfinder, an Occultist, or probably potentially a Elementalist. So definitely a pretty interesting one there. Maybe not an Elementalist, actually. I'd probably take that one back. But yeah, probably those two, maybe something else if you want to kind of go down that route. So Ethereal Knives, definitely one that's pretty interesting and one that you could look into. Next up, we have Spark. So it's no surprise, Spark has always been a very powerful skill, right up there with Ethereal Knives. It used to be one of the best clear skills in the game, and it's kind of come and gone as we've kind of played through the different leagues. Both Ethereal Knives and Spark were the kind of choices of skill for aura stackers. That isn't by mistake. These are the two best spells pretty much for clearing in the game, and they do have pretty good scaling and even better scaling now. But it basically got the Ethereal Knives treatment. Spark, you know, is going to be pretty high damage, especially if you can take advantage of Spark's shotgunning and preload potential. So what do I mean by that? So Spark is one of the most interesting skills in the game, as you can precast it and basically set it up like mines. Overall, if you're ever looking at a group kind of play scenario or a bossing kind of duo, generally they'll be using Spark, as you can kind of litter the field or litter the arena with sparks, and then the boss spawns, all the sparks just hit it, and then it just instantly dies. This is potentially something that you can look into doing as a solo player. In the past, it's been quite powerful. They haven't nerfed any of that, and they've just only buffed Spark. Similar to EK, it's about 50% more base, and they've basically doubled the effectiveness of added damage, which is pretty interesting. Overall, Spark definitely looks like a pretty interesting choice to kind of play around with. Maybe you can make something happen with a Spark mapper as a league starter. Overall, it could be pretty cool. All right, next up we have one that has actually moved off my list. So initially I did have Ignite Elementalist as a hybrid build that you may want to select. Generally people play this as, you know, some form of Armageddon brand build, or some form of Flame Burst build, or some combination of both of them. But they have actually received some pretty, you know, kind of crazy adjustments, which push them into the maybe tier. So overall, Ignite builds have received about a 10% more damage buff, which is definitely good, but they've received a quality of knife nerf. So specifically for fire burst, this is a pretty big problem. It went from a 1 second cooldown, basically means your fire burst is going to be hitting every 1 second, to a 1.5 second cooldown, which is definitely going to make your clear significantly worse. It's going to feel significantly worse. On bossing, you'll have more damage, but in clear, you'll be worse off. So it's definitely a bit questionable. And in terms of Armageddon Brand, in terms of Ignite, there's definitely some potential here. It's got a 10% damage buff, but they changed the activation time of the actual brand to 1.5 seconds from 1 second. So basically, the way that Armageddon Brand works is you cast it, it takes 1.5 seconds now to do its initial hit, and then you have to wait for the Ignite to kill the monsters. So there's definitely a lot of time in there where you can just die, which is definitely not optimal, meaning you have to build a much more defensive character, and overall it's not going to feel as good as some of the other builds on this list up here, which is why it kind of got relegated to the maybe list. Definitely something that could still be experimented with. The damage buffs are definitely nice, and it could be a pretty good candidate, but overall definitely not as powerful, in my opinion, in terms of the quality of life as it once was. Alright, next up we have Arc. So Arc is a pretty interesting one. It's been in and out of the meta for a while now. It has received quite a massive buff, which is pretty impressive. And it is kind of one of those skills which really does kind of be a bit of a comfort pick for a lot of players. And it's also a great skill to get started on, because Arc is a skill which is curated by Enki. So Enki is a build creator which pretty much only makes Arc builds, and he makes them very, very beginner friendly. So if you're just starting out, probably if Enki does update his guide, I'd go ahead and look for it. I imagine he probably will, and Arc might be a pretty good league starter. It's definitely not on the power of any of these other league starters up here, but the reason it's here is because Enki does generally put out a very, very beginner friendly guide, and I definitely recommend checking it out if you're kind of a little bit rusty, or you're kind of like a bit new. Arc is potentially something you want to look into if he does update his guide, which I imagine he will. Alright, lastly we have Phys Trapper. So Phys Trapper was undoubtedly probably one of the best, if not the best builds to league start in 3.17 as a bosser. It had absolutely ridiculous scaling, it had the options to go for defense, and it had pretty damn good clear to boot, but it has received some questionable nebulous nerfs. We're not actually sure what the nerfs are. They're not numerical nerfs, they're mechanical nerfs. But it's kind of here in the maybe, as Toxic Rain received some similarly nebulous nerfs a few leagues ago, and it's definitely here. It's definitely a contender. It's still really, really good. But the Phys Trapper nerfs kind of do sound a little bit weird. So if you guys didn't know how Phys Trapper worked, essentially they used a trap called Seismic Trap, which kind of pulses massive AoE blasts. And these AoE blasts deal about as much damage as a normal skill did, but there was about 5 of them. And you could kind of overlap them as well. And the more AoE you got, you could basically get all 5 of them to overlap and do 5 times the damage of pretty much any other build, or something like that. Something along those lines. And they're not removing, they're adjusting that overlapping mechanic. We have no idea how much or how they're adjusting the mechanic really, but it is definitely going to affect the build in probably a pretty massive way. However, it may be the case that it's still really insane, just like Toxic Rain was. We just don't know yet. So that's why Phys Trapper is here. League starting is definitely going to be a little bit scary. It might be questionable, but you may get rewarded in the long run if you do go for Phys Trapper, as the gear might be super cheap, as no one else started it, and also it may be reasonably unhindered. Having said that though, the actual clear damage of this build did get hit as well. It used Exsanguinate traps to clear mobs in the map, and that did get hit quite hard with the trap changes on the patch, on the manifesto. So definitely something to consider there. Phys Trapper has been nerfed on pretty much all fronts except defense, but with the damage nerfs, you're probably going to have to invest more into damage, and as such less into defense, meaning your character is going to be weaker just overall. So that's going to be kind of my analysis, guys, of the league start meta. Of course, anything can happen. There can be new entrants. There could be, like, brand new things in the expansion, things could get ninja nerfed in the patch notes, mods could get removed on weapons. We have no idea, but this is my best guess, and the intention of this video is that it gives you guys a bit of an overview of what's possible, what's probably going to be good from someone who's a little bit experienced in the game, and kind of a direction and start to go in. You should definitely go and check out all of the people I mentioned in this video, and there's going to be plenty of guides out on all of these kind of videos. So on all these kind of builds, I'm probably going to be, making a dedicated high-quality guide on Corrupting Fever, as well as one of the others on this list, not sure which. Crouching Tuna Palstron for Explosive Arrow. We got Zoro for Poisonous Concoction. I'm sure one of the minion guys is going to Skeleton Mages. Path of Math for Miner. Hardcore boys or other people for Detonate Dead. And I think Lighty is your man for Toxic Rain. So overall, those are some pretty good suggestions, and I definitely look into them. And hopefully you guys stay tuned for more videos. Until next time, cheers.